It's undeniable that inequality is rampant across the globe. The world's richest 1% own 44% of the world's wealth, while the bottom half hold less than 2%. And this inequality exists between countries as well. Economist Branko Milanovic is well known for his work on income distribution and inequality. His research shows that in 1820, the world's richest countries were only 3 times richer than the poorest, but that gap today is closer to 1 to 100. Inequality took a giant leap forward as a result of the Industrial Revolution and has further been accelerated by globalization. While most economists agree that globalization has helped the poorest people around the world, it has helped the world's richest a lot more. Inequality can be very difficult to define. The most quantified type is economic inequality, and there are also a whole range of social inequalities, as well as several categories that fit within the economic sphere. Our key focuses of today are going to be wealth and income inequality, and I'll be looking at these aspects through the following 4 questions. Has inequality been increasing? What are the different concepts of inequality, and are some more important than others? Can it be fixed, and how do we go about it? And finally, looking at the data and research, does inequality actually matter? So has inequality been increasing? There are several ways to measure inequality, the most widely cited being the Gini index, measuring the extent to which distribution within an economy deviates from perfectly equal distribution. Now, some economists argue that income has too many flaws to be the primary measure of inequality. Some of these issues include things like measuring income before accounting for tax, household incomes varying significantly over time, and that it's actually an inaccurate reflection of all of the available resources, things like government aid, unemployment benefits, and family wealth. Another way of measuring inequality is by consumption. While some argue that this is an important measurement tool, graphs from the Pew Research Center show how consumption inequality hasn't actually changed significantly. The final way of looking at inequality that I'm going to mention is in relative terms versus absolute terms. In relative terms, it has been decreasing. As measured by the Gini coefficient, it's declined from 0.73 in 1975 to 0.63 in 2010. But in absolute terms, it has actually been increasing. Focusing on absolute growth, we would almost always see that growth in rich countries is greater than that of growth in poor countries. Thus, between nations, inequality is more often than not measured relatively rather than by absolutes. Looking at the graphs, we see how a 1% increase in absolute incomes in North America or East Asia would be greater than a 1% increase in South Asia or Sub-Saharan Africa. Despite, should the increases incur simultaneously, relative inequality would remain the same. Most scholars are in agreement that both relative and absolute inequality need to be addressed. However, relative inequality tends to be favored in empirical research. Previously mentioned economist Branko Milanovic provides reasons why relative measurements tend to be preferred. The first being conservatism. Absolute measurements show inequality is arguably worse than it actually is. Milanovic describes how inequality at times is a very inflammatory topic, and we do not want to err in the direction of inflaming it further. Secondly, precision. Focusing on absolute distance sets forth the idea that an increase in the mean is essentially an increase in inequality. Thirdly, relative growth. Growth is measured relatively, i.e., the measures we use to assess economic success or failure should also be applied to inequality. Another important distinction to make is inequality within countries versus between countries. Within countries, we do see that inequality has increased. However, factors such as the rise of China and Asia and the fact that over 1 billion people have been lifted out of poverty in the last 4 years has decreased inequality between countries. But the question remains of why inequality increases within countries. One theory suggested is the skills bias technical change. This shift in production that values high-skilled labor over unskilled labor. Advancements in technology often require more educated, more able, and more experienced workers, essentially cutting out the 258 million children who are not able to go to school due to a lack of income, thereby stopping them from accessing these high-skill, high-pay jobs. The skills bias technical change also provides an explanation for what is known as job polarization. While in modern economies, the high-skilled workers are earning more, manufacturing production tends to move overseas where low-skilled workers take on jobs for very low pay, meaning that the only jobs left we have are the high-skill high pay and the low-skill low pay. Now moving on to look at different concepts of inequality, we're going to be focusing on income and wealth inequalities. In short, income refers to what a person or household earns, while wealth refers to the stock of assets held by a person at a single point in time. As previously mentioned, some scholars have suggested that income is not a sufficient means of measuring inequality. There are indications that people on low pay are increasingly unlikely to escape these low-income jobs. And while they may not be worse off by historical comparison, their absolute income is several times smaller than those in high-paying jobs. Wealth inequality tends to be greater than income inequality. In Australia, for example, the top 20% own only 5 times more than the bottom 20%, while holding 71 times the wealth. Another key aspect of the income-wealth divide is that wealth arguably has a greater impact on one's life. More wealth allows people to have better education, better health, and better access to higher-paying jobs. Wealth inequality is also more significant between countries and is increasing. Europe and North America, for example, have less than 20% of the world's population, but hold around 67% of global wealth, while India and Africa together have about 30% of the world's population, but only hold 2% of the wealth. Something to consider, however, is that data on wealth can be very hard to come by, so for researchers it's very hard to find a definitive answer about how wealth is actually distributed. Now, before exploring the morality and philosophical arguments surrounding inequality, we should first address whether we can actually fix it and how do we go about it. In 2014, the Haas Institute released a publication suggesting policy-based solutions for inequality in the US. These are the most common policy changes that have been advised globally as well. These researchers suggest simply that inequality is not the inevitable side effect of capitalism. The 4 key new policy changes they suggest are increasing the minimum wage, implementing tax reform measures, investing in early childhood education, and supporting economic and racial integration in neighbourhoods. Research has shown that increasing the minimum wage will help lift nearly 4.6 million Americans out of poverty. It will also increase consumer spending and is said to have positive psychological effects, increasing productivity and reducing reliance on government payouts. However, the flip side of this is that employers are likely to tighten budgets and may lay off workers or not hire new ones, slowing the job growth. Or companies may actually increase consumer prices to account for increased costs. Tax policy can also play a significant role in making the post-tax income distribution more equal. Not only does it raise revenues to finance public expenditure, which can be used to increase services like education and childcare, increased taxes on higher incomes and the potential to introduce more land and housing taxes are all proposed to help even out income distribution, as well as better access to financial services and home ownership to help increase the wealth of the poor. However, tax must be approached cautiously. There are extensive networks that the super wealthy use to avoid paying taxes. Countries also need a very strong tax administration. Another critique we also often see is that increased taxes can actually reduce average incomes. The third point we have here is investment in early childhood education, particularly for the most disadvantaged, and this can have extensive influences on a child's health, social skills, and learning capacity, all of which are necessary for success in schools and later life. James Heckman, an American economist, suggested a 13% return on investment per child per annum if the US chooses to invest more in early childhood education. Our final point here essentially means addressing the racial residential segregation. Segregation by income tends to appear in several forms, including the locations of public housing, discriminatory home ownership practices, and exclusionary school zoning practices, all of which contribute to cycles of poverty. In essence, all of these policy suggestions have both pros and cons, and a key difficulty actually relates to their implementation. However, fixing inequality is no simple task. The issue has been plaguing public debate for the last few decades and is likely to continue to do so. There is also no consensus on how inequality should actually be addressed. Some experts have suggested increasing union rights or attempting to reduce or constrain the financial market. Others vie for a no government intervention method, suggesting that poverty and inequality are individual problems rather than collective. But now that we've established that there is no clear, simple way to address inequality, we must ask whether or not it actually matters. And there are scholars that argue vividly for both sides of the debate. John Rawls, for example, an American philosopher, didn't believe that inequality was inherently a bad thing. He believed that inequality that benefited all members of society was not unjust, as long as these inequalities were arranged to be to everyone's advantage and the inequality applied to positions open to all, there is no problem. Another philosopher, Harry Frankfurt, held a similar stance, in that society has misidentified the problem. It's not that some people have more or less, it's that some people don't have enough. When we live in a society where some are born with much more than they need and others don't have enough to live a healthy life, the logical conclusion is that inequality is the problem. Frankfurt suggested that eliminating inequality should not be the goal, rather a byproduct of measures to eliminate poverty. Following this train of thought, there are actually some benefits to inequality. Things like the incentive effect, referring to the principle that if someone works harder and ultimately receives a higher wage, then this can encourage extra effort and lead to a higher national output. This also relates to the concept of fairness, the argument being made that people deserve a higher income if their skills merit it. But it is commonly agreed among researchers that the extent of inequality we have in the world today is not acceptable. The pros that I described previously reflect a healthy, competitive degree of inequality, not our current situation where some people are born into wealth that will only keep increasing, while others are likely to spend their whole lives living on less than $1 a day. This unfair advantage of inherited wealth is one of the many cons of economic inequality. Others include things like social problems relating to higher crime rates and social friction, which can lead to riots and more protests. Other issues with economic inequality is higher unemployment rates. We also have the monopoly powers of country and political influence that stems from wealth. Problems surrounding the relationship between wealth and disproportionate political influence ties into the final aspect of inequality that I'm going to talk about, which is inequality of opportunity. Unequal opportunity exacerbates economic inequality as the circumstances and locations of one birth act as constraints on the opportunities presented to them as children. As I mentioned earlier, an essential problem with wealth inequality is that some people are born with so much more than others, and it's no secret that wealthy families have access to the best education, healthcare, and can use connections to gain internships, ultimately leading to better careers and more wealth. Now, returning to the initial questions that I presented at the beginning of the video. Has inequality been increasing? What are the different concepts of inequality, and are some more important than others? Can it be fixed, and how do we go about it? And finally, does inequality actually matter? The first three questions have been comprehensively answered throughout this video. However, it is the last question that ultimately matters. There is no purpose in denying that inequality exists and is very prevalent in our society today. And the conclusion that we can draw from this is that yes, inequality does matter. I agree with John Rawls's contention that inequality is not inherently a bad thing. A heart surgeon who has completed more than 12 years of medical school to be in the position that they are undoubtedly deserves a higher income than a local butcher or farmer. But the issue arises when not everyone has equal opportunity to pursue these careers equally. Inequality is a decisive issue of public debate. But if we had equal opportunity, without barriers to education, without racial, gender, age, even citizenship discrimination, would people still be able to justify their anger at someone having more because they have worked to put themselves in that position?